Have you seen these images? Well, it may surprise you, but they could have been Buenos Aires. In June 1806, the then capital of the Viceroy of the Rio de la Plata was invaded by the English, who, after a couple of months, were expelled. The following year, the same situation rose again, with the same result. So today, the joke among some Argentines is that, had it not been for the heroic action of the Creoles, Argentina could be like Australia today. Of course, we will never really know what would have happened, and of course, if history tells us anything, it is that the successes or failure of a country depends above all on the institutions that would have been implemented. In the case of Argentina, which we have talked about so many times here before, is a good proof about this. We have made a lot of videos about Argentina, but we were missing one key issue. Looking at the state this country is in today, it may seem like a myth, almost a Martian science fiction story, but the truth is that there was a time when Argentina was a very wealthy country, one of the richest countries in the world, maybe even the richest of all. The question is, how is this possible? Was Argentina really such a rich place? And if so, why on earth was it so different from the country we find today? And another very important question, given the allergy that Argentine politicians currently have to international trade and foreign capital, what role did they play in that supposed golden era? Well, let's find out.
The origin of a nation.
At the end of the 18th century, the Spanish crown decided to create the Viceroyalty of the Rio de Plata, placing the capital in the city of Buenos Aires. At that time, in this remote and sparsely inhabited region was not particularly interesting for the Spanish Empire. However, English smuggling and Portuguese expansion from Brazil made the crown take notice of this place, and they began to care more about it. Hence, they decided to establish a more significant presence in the region. However, the decline of the empire, the poor economic health, the occupation of Spain by Napoleon's troops, and the spread of the Enlightenment triggered independence movements in practically all the American territories of the empire between 1810 and 1825, with the sole exception of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so, among the separatist territories was what we now know today as Argentina, which on the 25th of May 1810 deposed Viceroy Cisneros to proclaim a local government. Let's just say that the formal excuse was that with the King of Spain imprisoned by Napoleon, power was returning to the people. Well, just 6 years later, on the 9th of July 1816, Argentina declared its definitive independence, although it hardly brought peace. Conflicts and local wars followed one after the other. At stake were those who would occupy the government and what kind of government would be established. Fundamentally, there was two great factions, the Unitaros and the Federales. You see, the conflict was very much determined by the power that Buenos Aires accumulated over the rest of the provinces. As Buenos Aires had a port and customs, which were two main sources of wealth, this territory considered that it ought to have more rights than the rest of them. For their part, the provinces of the interior argued that these resources belonged to everyone, and that they should be shared equally, and that there should be no extraordinary rights. In any case, the conflict dragged on for almost 50 years. The dispute was only finally resolved in the middle of the 19th century when the Constitution of 1853 was approved and the city of Buenos Aires was federalized in 1880. But do you know what? After the proclamation of independence, the approval of this constitution was something like the second founding moment of Argentina. It was from that moment when Argentina really began to be built, and when the institutions that completely changed the country and put it on the road to being one of the leading places in the world began to be set up. And guess what? This is where one of the key names in Argentine history appears, Juan Bautista Alberdi, who was considered the father of the Constitution, even though he did not participate in the Constituent Convention in charge of the writing of the Constitution. However, he did publish a book entitled Bases and Starting Points for the Political Organization of the Argentine Republic, which was the work that influenced the Constitution. Basically, you could say that it laid the foundation stones. But why are we telling you this here on VisualPolitik? Well, because in this work, Alberdi explains the obstacles that the country faced in order to achieve development. Because at that time, Argentina did not have precious metals, nor a large population, nor was it close to the developed world. So it needed a very competitive political framework that would allow the country to join the second industrial revolution. Along these lines, Alberdi identified four main obstacles that it had to be overcome in order to leave poverty behind and really take off. Number one, lack of capital. Number two, the scarcity of population. Keep in mind that at that time, Argentina was practically an uninhabited place with barely 2 million people. Number three, lack of infrastructure. And finally, the lack of legal certainty, especially in terms of guaranteeing private property and freedom of enterprise. That was number four. I don't know, it might almost seem that we are talking about the 21st century, but the truth is that we are talking about the 19th century. You can see that many of the problems are repeated over and over again. In fact, we could almost say that in many respects, today's Argentina has gone back in time almost 200 years. But let's not get sidetracked. The point is that all these concerns were reflected in the Constitution of 1853, which gave a free hand to the arrival of foreign investments and immigrants, guaranteed private property, and promoted the development of railroads. And so, with the new constitution, during the time of the first 3 presidents of Argentina, the country began to prosper. A process that accelerated after 1880, when the country was completely pacified. The city of Buenos Aires was integrated as a federal capital, and Patagonia was incorporated. From that moment on, the period of greatest economic growth in the country's history began. We are talking about a process that lasted more than 50 years and that would place Argentina among the 10 richest and most prosperous countries in the world in the first decade of the 20th century. At that time, the Argentine dream was the equivalent of the American dream. In less than 4 decades, the country had become one of the world's leading food producers, with nearly 12 million hectares planted, 5 million tons of grains exported, and millions of head of cattle. And that was not all. The country also had some of the most modern infrastructure in the world, with large ports, urban tramways, and 28,000 kilometers of railways running throughout the country. Now, at this point, the question we have to ask ourselves is, exactly how did Argentina change, and what made its economy take off to become one of the richest and most prosperous in the world? Can we find any concrete example of all this prosperity? The truth is that we can highlight 4 major changes that marked a turning point. Stay tuned, because next we're going to see exactly how this country changed. This is an example of what can be achieved in just a few years. Check this out.
Dream target.
Following Alberdi's principles, the Constitution of 1853 not only opened the doors to immigration, but also promoted it with the idea of populating a gigantic territory that was practically deserted. And so, between the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, millions and millions of Europeans arrived in search of a better life. To give you an idea, Argentina was the second favorite destination for Europeans, only after the United States. From the beginning of the 20th century, immigration was constantly increasing. Spaniards, Italians, Germans, Greeks, and a lot of other nationalities. In 1905, the population was already just over 5,800,000 inhabitants, and yet in just 6 years, it grew by another million.
And why are you going to Argentina? Well, just like everyone else, to see if I can get out of poverty. Dialogue between political law professor Adolfo Posada and a Spanish immigrant in 1910.
The question is, what exactly did the country have to offer? Well, besides a lot of work, there were also much higher salaries. For example, thanks to the enormous prosperity that was pumping, the salaries received by Spanish immigrants in Argentina was 3 times higher than the salaries they received in Spain. And in the case of the Italians, they were double. Of course, not everything was so wonderful. Hard work and social protests were the order of the day. But, naturally, given the facts in hand, it's not surprising that when an immigrant arrived, they soon convinced their relatives and friends to pack all their bags and move to the Argentine dream as well. And this caused not only the country's population to skyrocket, but it also grew much faster than the populations of countries like Australia or Canada. Surprised? Well, let's go on.
The arteries of a new power.
Another of the great changes, and at the same time, one of the factors that boosted the economy, was the development of a modern railroad network. Of course, in such a vast country with very few navigable rivers, the railroad was a key piece of infrastructure for transporting goods quickly and cheaply. The good news is that at the time, the country's leaders were very clear about this. Soon, thousands and thousands of miles of lines began to be built. Between 1865 and 1910, the railway network grew from less than 500 kilometers, 310 miles, to more than 30,000 kilometers, over 18,000 miles. The tracks linked Bolivia with Puerto Deseado, the Andes with the Atlantic, and the humid Pampas with the port of Buenos Aires, which is where almost 80% of international trade entered and left. To give you an idea, in 1910, Argentina was ranked number 10 in the world in terms of railroad progress. And take note that in relation to the surface area, the Argentine network was larger than the network in Canada or Australia. But that's not the end of it. Let's continue.
The roulette of prosperity.
Another change was the enormous expansion of the Argentine economy. This, we have already said, in a way, is the subject of this video. But just how prosperous was Argentina? Well, you see, according to Angus Madison's estimates, by the 1910, only 7 countries in the entire world were more prosperous: Belgium, Switzerland, Great Britain, and the 4 historic British colonies and their economic successes: Canada, Australia, the United States, and New Zealand. In fact, briefly between 1895 and 1896, it was considered the richest country in the world. And so, in 1909, for example, Argentina's per capita income was 50% higher than that of Italy, 180% higher than that of Japan, and almost 5 times higher than that of neighboring Brazil. But do you want more data? Of course you do, so check this out. In that same year of 1910, Argentina was the world's leading exporter of wheat, corn, beef, mutton and lamb, and wool. Between 1900 and 1913, and this is important, Argentine exports represented 2.1% of the total of all global exports, and in 1909 they reached 2.6%. By comparison, the same period of time, Australia only had a share of 1.5%. What a difference! To put it simply, Argentina was flying high. The countryside made the country an agricultural power. The cities did not stop expanding, and at the same time, services and industry just kept growing as well. But wait a moment, because we still have to highlight one last great change that took place in the country. A change that made Argentina a leader in a field that I'm sure you would never have thought of.
The Argentine brain.
In the second half of the 19th century, Argentina made an enormous effort in education. During that time, hundreds of schools were founded and even educational professionals were brought from the United States. And that's not all. In 1882, President Julio Roca enacted the law known as Law 1420 on primary education, a law that established free, compulsory, and secular education. Keep in mind that this was very rare at the time, so it's not surprising that schools and institutes suddenly began to sprout like mushrooms all over the country. Thanks to this, in just 6 decades between 1869 and 1939, illiteracy was reduced to less than a fifth, from 70% to less than 20%. And okay, I know that today this figure may seem very high. However, we have to remember what era we're talking about. For example, while in 1914 in Argentina, 35% of the population did not know how to read or write, at that same time in Spain, that figure reached no less than 59%. Then, in addition, university studies also became much more popular than was common in Europe. In other words, Argentina was growing in production, in population, in infrastructure, and also in education. And it did so much more than European countries and the vast majority of countries in the world at the time. Do you remember the joke we talked about at the beginning of this video about the English invasion of Buenos Aires? Well, the truth is that it didn't need any help. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was already like Australia. The Argentine capital, Buenos Aires, was even known as the Paris of South America. Unfortunately, however, this prosperity did not last long. And here, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. Take a look at this. It was not a myth. That country really did exist. The Argentina of successes was a reality. The process took them about 100 years. First, they gained independence from Spain. At that time, the territory was very poor, and then they needed 50 years to enact their constitution and get things going. And then another 50 years until they recorded their peak between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But why did it all turn around? We've answered that question for you in a bunch of videos here on VisualPolitik. But for now, it's over to you. Do you think Argentina will shine again someday? What do you think has to happen for prosperity to return to the country? Leave us your answer in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. Thank you very much for watching, all the best, and I'll see you next time.